Linux Luddites, episode 53, for the 13th of September, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. And regular listeners to the show will have noticed that we recently changed how we put the show out. We went from having a 2-hour one every couple of weeks to a 1-hour one weekly, and that's generally gone down really well with the listeners, and it's made it a little bit more accessible, I think. We struggled, though, to work out how to carve our various segments up, and particularly the news, because that tends to vary in length enormously, and we've not really been very happy with what we've been doing.
Yeah, we went back through the various shows that we've done and just looked at how many news items there were and then how long the total news took, and we found it varied by sort of up to 10 minutes, which is quite difficult when you're trying to plan a 1-hour show if the news is between 20 minutes and 30 odd. So we're trying to look for a way of being able to plan our shows a bit better.
Yeah, and I think the news coverage we provide is something that we used to be quite well known for, to be honest. There's a lot of other shows out there that really skate the surface, and we wanted to come back to where we started off. So this show, we're going to go through the news and take as long as it takes.
Yeah, and then in the next show, we won't do any news. We'll just kind of do features and feedback and stuff. So essentially, we're going to split the old format in half, rather than trying to do news in both the shows.
Well, that's enough talking about what we're going to do. Should we get on and do it?
Yeah, go on then. First up in the news then is an open source typeface called Hack that brings design to source code. And programmer Chris Simpkins has released version 2.0 of Hack. And it's a typeface that's designed specifically to be used in source code and solves a problem that I hadn't really thought about, to be honest, which is that O's and zeros look similar, ones and L's, Z's and twos, that sort of thing, which in a Word document, a letter, it's embarrassing. In source code, it could be critical. So I can see why you would need this, but as someone who doesn't write code, it's not something I'd ever thought about. Presumably you had, Paddy.
I must admit, I use Droid Sans generally on the desktop, which is Apache 2 licensed, but it isn't a great font for programming. The difference between zeros and capital O's, not much at all, to be honest. I don't know. I mean, when I write longhand, I tend to put slashes through zeros in a sort of European style, and that's something that I've not seen many people in the UK do even.
I think I remember Linux Outlaws talking about this, and it was the first time it really occurred to me as well. And now, even though I don't program a lot, it's mostly just bash scripts and things, I also spot if a 1 and a lowercase l is just a single line. It's impossible to see. And I noticed the other day that there's an update to LastPass, and when you look to show your password on your phone, let's say, to then write it into a web browser of someone else's PC you might be using, it actually colours the numbers so that there's a clear distinction between what a O and a 0 would be, or an uppercase and lowercase and things. So they clearly see this problem as well. But the description on the website there showing sixes and capital G's and things are examples that had never really occurred to me. And so he's clearly made this very crisp at the sorts of sizes that you'd have on a normal display as well, sort of 8 to 12 pixels.
Yeah, it was funny listening to a different podcast the other day and hearing John C. Dvorak being caught out by the sixes and G's.
A rare thing, I'll bet. We've also had an update to the Trinity desktop. So this is basically a fork and the sort of spiritual successor to KDE 3 in the same way that Mate is of GNOME 2. At the end of August, the Trinity desktop R1401, a maintenance release, was put out. And it's sort of following the KDE 3 sort of era, if you will, and is aimed at lower end hardware. So includes desktop effects that are still compatible with sort of older hardware, doesn't require 3D accelerator, but ultimately, I'd have said, while it still maintains the WIMP desktop that a lot of people like and KDE 3 always had, it does look a bit dated, whereas I feel Mate has been brought up to speed and had some tweaks and things. This does look to me like a desktop that is still a little bit situated in the past.
Yeah, that's really what I wanted to talk about and why I stuck it in the news here. I mean, the other feature that's noticeable about this release is they're starting work on the FreeBSD side of things, so it'll be available on that platform as well. We've spoken about Q4 OS on the show previously, and I quite liked it, and Joe didn't. And apart from that, the only distro I can find using this is something called EXE GNU/Linux. As you say, it looks really dated. I think it's down to the XP-esque, almost cartoon-like character of the KDE look at the time.
Yeah, the cartoon character as well as the sort of grey toolbars and grey backgrounds for the windows, whereas a lot of other desktops have either gone to toolbars which are semi-transparent or that mirror the bulk colour. So, for example, if I change the desktop background on Unity, the colour of the toolbar changes to a similar sort of tone, so it remains in keeping with the overall look.
But surely we're just talking about the default look here. And if you look at the default XFCE, that looks horrendous. But then people take it and make things like Ubuntu looks all right, and Manjaro, which I think looks really nice. So surely someone could theme it in a nicer way and it wouldn't look so dated and horrendous.
Yeah, and that's what they've done within Q4 OS. They provide various skins that look like different versions of Windows, if you remember. It does kind of come back to what we've spoken about previously, though, on the show, and that first impressions matter. And if you look at something and you think, oh, my Lord, you're going to walk away from it rather than investing the time to find out whether you can theme it. So I think having an iffy theme out of the box is a really bad idea. I understand why they do it, because it's obviously trying to appeal to KDE3 users, because that's how bad KDE3 used to look. But it's a very functional desktop, and as you made the comparison there with Mate, I don't see why it can't be up there alongside that sort of desktop environment and being used by as many distros as that sort of desktop. But it isn't, and I suspect how it looks when you first install it has a large amount to do with that.
I think another part of why it's not more popular is because Plasma 5 is actually quite nice, isn't it? If you want to have a traditional WIMP-style desktop with KDE, then you kind of don't need to go back to KDE 3 because 4 was just a horrendous nightmare. But now 5 is so much better than 4 that if I was going to go for KDE, I definitely wouldn't bother with the old one. Whereas with GNOME 3, it's fundamentally different from Mate. Whereas if you look at 3 and 5 of KDE, they're laid out roughly in the same way. And there's no fundamental difference there. But 5's just light years ahead in terms of styling and modernity.
Yeah, but what if you've got really weak hardware and you're wanting to, for instance, run Gwenview in its native environment?
Well, I feel it's also a little bit chicken and egg because, Joe, as you pointed out about XFCE, my first impression of XFCE was on Ubuntu, and I was then surprised that when I did an install of something else and pulled XFCE on afterwards, how bad it looked. My first impression of Mate was a refined version, I think, on Linux Mint, and then I don't think I've ever installed the stock Mate on top of a distro. So if there are no distros shipping this with a nice, elegant theme, someone's put the time in to try and make it look better than the stock, then no one's going to get it in their head that it can look nice. So like I say, if no one's showing it at its best and no one's therefore willing to give it a try, it's a bit sort of chicken egg, whereas XFCE has had many instances where it can really, really shine.
Well, to be fair, the default Mate looks all right. It doesn't look amazing, but it's not as horrendous as XFCE.
Well, I suspect we go round in circles on this. So if I can just leave with a passing thought that I quite like Trinity as a desktop environment. It's obviously a little bit too configurable as per its roots, but I'd just like to see other people using it. But I don't think that's going to happen until the developer actually starts putting it out looking unlike KDE 3. So moving it on then, let's talk about the Raspberry Pi and several announcements. First up is the official 7-inch touchscreen has been released, and it's going to be on sale for $60, which is about £48 in real money. It's an 800 by 480 display. It's powered from the Pi's GPIO port, and there's a ribbon cable connects to the display serial interface port.
Yeah, this is long awaited. Apparently it was ready a year ago, but then they were trying to iron out some of the problems with it and make sure it passed all the standards that it needed to. And it's pretty cool that you can have one power supply that's powering the screen and the Pi and effectively turn it into a little tablet. Although it is fairly expensive for what it is. It's not huge resolution. And I looked on eBay and stuff, and you can get some 7-inch displays a little bit cheaper than that. But this guarantees that it's going to work, and you're not going to have ugly hacks. This is just going to work with Raspbian, and it's because it's official, it's much more likely to be supported by other distros once they get the time to sort that out. So things like Ubuntu Mate and even BSD and Riscos and all that kind of stuff. So I can see why it's worth paying that little bit more for it. It would have been nice if it had been 720p, but I suppose for a 7-inch display, it's not the end of the world to be that low res. And I would love to get my hands on one, but I'm trying to declutter at the moment.
Well, it's also got 10-point touch support, so rather than it just being a screen for whatever it is you want to display, you can also interact with it and, like you said, Joe, sort of make it into a tablet almost. But it'd just be nice if the Raspberry Pi had some way of storing more information on it.
Was that an attempt at a terrible segue?
Yes,
Jesse?
it was.
That was my segue extraordinaire.
Oh, Paddy, save us.
Yeah, I think what Jesse's alluding to is the Pi Drive, which is Western Digital's new 1 terabyte hard drive kit for the Raspberry Pi. Specifically designed, apparently. This costs $80. It comes with a 4 gigabyte micro SD card, supposedly for your operating system, but it does seem like a bit of a gimmick to me. And it's got a weird multi-headed cable, so it can connect both to the USB and power ports on the Pi, and also to an external power supply, all at the same time. Clearly because it draws far too much juice to be solely USB powered. And the basic idea is that you power the disk, and then that powers the actual Pi itself. And it's compatible with the B Plus and the Pi 2 Model B.
Yeah, it does seem like quite a nice, neat solution to get loads of storage on the Pi. I mean, you could just do it with a powered hard drive or a powered USB hub. But yeah, I suppose the simplicity of it is its appeal here.
Yeah, I think the simplicity and the compactness is only slightly larger than the footprint of the Raspberry Pi because it's one of those laptop hard drives. And it doesn't say, but I assume for that price it's a spinning drive and for that size. So yeah, if you wanted to, perhaps the first thing I thought about this is if you wanted to set up the Raspberry Pi as like a video camera, like a security camera or something like that, and you wanted it to store all that data for long periods, then this is the kind of thing you'd need, or maybe a media server or something.
Or maybe you need the storage capacity to record lots of voice. Because the final Pi story we've got this week is about Mycroft. And this is a project I don't think we've talked about much on this show, but I'm going to ask some opinions on in a minute. Their Kickstarter has finished. They raised $127,500, which was more than the $99,000 they were looking for. And apparently, unlike Purism, without the company executives putting in their own money to pump up the numbers. This is an artificial intelligence thing for the Pi, isn't it? But the Pi's got very little processing power. So how does it all work, Joe?
I'm supposed to be the expert because I do a podcast about the Raspberry Pi, am I?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my understanding of it is that the Pi itself is what's listening out for the voice commands, and then that will kind of pass them and send them somewhere to be processed. And that somewhere is either to the cloud or potentially to another machine on your network or plugged into the Pi, or potentially on the Pi if you don't mind it taking a while.
So is this all open source? Because I know the Pi is not totally really open source, but is the software side of it is?
That's my understanding of it. Yeah, that's certainly the promise.
Yeah, the actual local install is based on Ubuntu Snappy Core. And then from what I've seen on Kickstarter, it's all going to be open sourced so that you can see when it is listening to you. And when they say it's not listening to every single thing you say, only for the keyword of Mycroft, then you can actually, look in the code and check that.
But it's a bit strange that as soon as the Kickstarter finished, they launched an Indiegogo.
Yeah, I must admit, I thought that too. I mean, they said, quote, our original campaign was 127% funded with just over 1,100 backers on Kickstarter. With such strong backing, we've decided to continue the campaign so we can develop and ship our camera extension module. This module will give Mycroft the ability to see its environment and better interact with users. Now, they're only looking for $25,000 here, but like you, I think probably it's a little bit cheeky since they have not actually shipped anything at all yet.
Yeah, the original Kickstarter met not only the funding goal, but also one of the extended goals, which is that you could control your Linux desktop with it as well. So you could say, open this application or take a picture with my webcam and things like this. And people got quite excited about that and very happy that it reached that stretch goal. But I think to not reach the second stretch goal or wherever in the list of them that this camera module was, and therefore just take that extra money and request it somewhere else, does seem a little bit sort of, I don't know, a bit underhand almost, doesn't it?
It seems to me that this word has been spreading like wildfire about this, and they were getting more and more money coming in, and they ran out of time to get more money, and they know that there are potentially more people interested. And so for me, it just feels like a bit of a cash in, which I suppose I would probably do given the same circumstances, to be honest.
And just to make sure we paint the full picture for people who aren't so familiar with Mycroft, this is a little bit like Siri or sort of Google Now or Google Voice, where you can command it to do things, but not only take notes and start timers or check your emails, but also command your household Internet of Things. So you can ask it to put the kettle on in the morning, or you can ask it to shut the blinds or lock your house and things like this, all with Mycroft, do this, do that. And like Joe was saying, it does all the voice processing in the clouds and works out what the text is, and then analyzes that text as to what the actual command is trying to get to do. And so I think people were very excited about having it on the desktop as well, because it's that next step from keyboard and mouse into probably keyboard and mouse, but as well as being able to control, your TV and things like this if you've got media boxes connected up to it. So I think it's interesting, and I was tempted to sort of fund it, but at the same time, the hardware is a fairly, in my opinion, unattractive little box, which looks like a weird kind of robot thing with eyes and lights and things. And inside it is literally, they show opening up just a Raspberry Pi. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's a good thing from a hacking point of view. But I think I'd rather just wait for the software to come out and then implement it myself on a Raspberry Pi that I already own and attach a microphone to it and do that little sort of hackery project myself.
Yeah, I agree as well. If I were looking to do this, then I would be much more inclined to want to hack it together myself rather than just buying a kind of, a box that's doing it all for me. But I think the bigger point is that I don't want artificial intelligence in my house. Thank you very much. I don't want a robot, a machine controlling every aspect of my household life. I don't know. It just feels a bit like technological overload, but that's the way the world's going, isn't it?
Yeah, if you see their promotional video, which was on Kickstarter and may well be now be on Indiegogo, and the lady wakes up from an alarm clock and tells Mycroft to do something or ask the weather or something, and then says, Mycroft, speak to my daughter's room, so it opens up a channel through to there, and the mother wakes her daughter up over the house sort of audio system. And it's like, that is overkill. Where's the family love there?
Yeah, it's like Apple as well. I mean, I didn't pay any heed really to the recent launches, but I did see the headlines. I was skipping through my RSS feeds, and it jumped out at me that they were making a big thing out of the fact that Siri works even if the phone's turned off, which implies the phone isn't turned off and it's always switched on and always listening to you.
Yeah,
that is bizarre.
Anyway, if people want to keep up to date with developments on the Mycroft front, where should they go, Joe?
Well, no doubt we'll be covering it going forward on the Pi Podcast, which is at thepipodcast.com. Cha-ching. But from the birth of something new to the death of something old, and that's the Lilo bootloader. Is it Lilo or is it Lilo? I've always said it as Lilo, but even though it's Linux loader. And so development is going to cease at the end of this year, which I don't know really. I've never used it. I've always seen it as an option when you install Debian and stuff, but it grubs what I know about. So it's not a huge loss to me, although it kind of always feels like a loss when an open source project dies.
Yeah, I must admit I haven't used it for a good few years either. I think Slackware was the last time I installed Lilo, and I will say Lilo, not Lilo. Grub has just become ubiquitous. I mean, there was an attempt to build eLilo to cope with EFI systems. That was made by Hewlett-Packard originally. But that project also stalled about a year ago now. So I guess changes in technology, as much as anything, have put the kibosh on this.
Yeah, and the end of another era is that Christian Perino, the Ubuntu phone lead, has decided to move on. So he was working as the lead for Canonical's mobile strategy, including things like engaging with mobile operators and device manufacturers and the applications ecosystem. And he said in his post that he has enjoyed the time and seen it from inception through to where it is now and disrupting the sort of common market for mobile phones. And he says he's moving on to save the planet, which seems quite bold, with a sort of Fitbit type item for the planet. So there's no actual details on what that is, but it sounds like quite a grand thing to move on to, and is going to take up his entire time.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's fair play. I mean, they started off from nothing, and now the Ubuntu phone's completely finished and bug-free and works really well and is in millions of people's hands and pockets. So
very disruptive.
Yeah, incredibly disruptive.
Yeah, I had a look on the guy's LinkedIn profile, and it says he's now co-founder and CEO at a green tech stealth startup. So that doesn't really give any further details about what he's going to be up to. But yeah, I guess he obviously views it as job done, as Jesse says.
I'm just picturing George Bush in front of a flag saying mission accomplished.
Well, sticking with still developing technology then, let's talk about Qualcomm's Snapdragon 820. And that's not going to ship in any phones before early next year. But they're making an awful lot of noise about it. And this is based on a brand new custom 64-bit architecture called Cryo, I think it is, which is a successor to Crate. And the chip will initially run at clock speeds up to 2.2 gigahertz. And Qualcomm are claiming it'll be twice as fast as its predecessor, which was the 810, whilst also being twice as power efficient. And also the GPU it'll be coupled with is supposed to be 40% faster and 40% more power efficient than the 810 also.
All bad news for Intel then, and potentially good news for a decent converged Android-like operating system, because you're going to need as much power as you can to run a proper desktop. And it sounds like this kind of processor might be it might get to the point where we can actually start using phones and tablets as proper desktops.
Yeah, from memory, I think the 810 had some issues with overheating. It was one of those ones that was in the top end of phones, and when you're playing games or really thrashing it started to get warm in the hand. So I think the power efficiency and the thermal efficiency benefits of this one are going to be very much a beneficial thing. And these are going to be the ones that you're looking out for in the new flagships from Samsung and HTC, Motorola, and people like that. So we'll see probably in early 2016 the next suite of phones coming out with these.
Yeah, and something else they'll have. Well, that's kind of why I put the story in here. The 820 is coming along with something called Snapdragon Smart Protect, which is technology to detect zero-day and malware right down at the processor level. And it seems to be based on some machine learning algorithms that can spot when an app tries to do something suspicious. And the example they've given is of an app trying to send an SMS when the phone's supposedly sleeping. And they'll be providing an API for mainstream antivirus offenders to hook into as well. But this is kind of taking things to a completely new level of watching what's going on your phone, isn't it?
What are you talking about from a privacy point of view?
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose that's the way they always sell these things. Oh, it's going to be good for you. Like Google Now, it's always listening to be helpful, not for any dodgy reasons. Yeah, I don't know. It seems that it will be useful and helpful, but I don't know. When a big red flag for me is when antivirus firms start getting involved, because antivirus firms, to me, are just kind of, I don't know, the lowest of the low when it comes to computer stuff. I don't know, maybe I'm paranoid, but just the idea that they make the malware, put it out there, and then sell you products to get rid of it.
And then run for president.
Yeah. Oh, man. Let's not get too far into that. Let's move on to talk about x86 instead. And so with the Linux kernel 4.3, we're going to see some boot time optimizations. 100 microseconds here, 500 microseconds there, 100 microseconds there. So it's kind of not that significant. And, you could speed up your boot time much more easily by just getting an SSD or a decent RAID setup. But I suppose it's all a push in the right direction.
I think it's important that they do keep on looking at this side of things. I know you're saying it's only 500 microseconds here, 100 microseconds there, but these things do all add up, and especially if they're looking at some of the old code and trying to take that out. Only this morning I opened my Chromebook, walked into the lounge with it and put it on the table, and was gutted that it hadn't turned on by the time I was sat at my table. So I think people are getting more and more picky about how quickly things boot up. So these things are all good to keep on top of them. And if the audience can think back to our predictions show and the incredibly optimistic prediction that I made about the importance of Steam on Linux and how it's really going to blow away the competition, there's a couple of articles here sort of outlining just how well Linux is doing in the gaming area. So after a week of Windows 10 being released, its user base is currently larger than any one of the Mac OS operating systems and larger than all Linux distros combined. So just to put some numbers, Linux makes up 0.55% of all of the Steam players, and Windows 10 is at 2.3% after 1 week of being released. And I mean, people were forced to upgrade. So obviously, there's been a lot more upgrades than you would have had it been just a standard release like Windows 8. But it still is a little bit embarrassing. And to make matters even worse, there's a very popular game called Pillars of Eternity on Steam. And their developers were saying that it wasn't really worth the effort putting it onto Linux, because having done that and released it, and they're down the line now, so they can look back at the numbers, only 1.5% of users were from Linux. So it doesn't look like Linux is really shaking the market up that much. But also, let's not forget that the Steam boxes haven't come out yet. So I think the people who are developing for Linux are sort of hoping that they will also be able to go straight onto a Steam box, and that might improve the uptake of their games. But until they come out, it's currently a little bit like treading water, and people only tread water for so long, and so they're not going to bother doing it, I don't think.
I keep hearing this meme, Jesse, about people being forced to upgrade to Windows 10, but you're not.
You're not forced, but you are reminded heavily. I mean, my flatmate's got a Windows 8 laptop, and he constantly has to get rid of this little pop-up saying that he should do it. So you'd have to be fairly strong-willed, like he is, not to upgrade. So I think a lot of people will have done it and gone through the upgrade process.
Yeah, on Windows 7, I look after my dad's Windows 7 machine sometimes, and every time I go around there to look at it, it's in the system tray and it won't go away. This nagging thing: update to Windows 10, update to Windows 10. So I think you're right. Eventually, people just right, just to get rid of it, I'll do it.
Yeah, and of course they've also been downloading from the background, even if you've not asked for it.
Yeah.
But going back to the original stories, I mean, you mentioned, Jesse, that was like a week into Windows 10's general availability. I actually had a look at the Steam stats this morning and saw that Linux is currently on 0.92%. And Windows 10, if you add together the 32 and 64-bit versions together, is currently sat around 17% of all Steam users.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on it there, Jesse, that there are still no Steam boxes, or is it still no mainstream Steam boxes. There is Steam OS, and you can potentially make your own. And the controller, we covered that was due to come out. I don't know, I surely would have heard more about it if people were actually using them. And, this all started, all this talk of Steam on Linux and Steam OS and Steam controllers, around the Windows 8 time. Valve knew it wasn't a real viable platform. But now Windows 10's come out, they've missed the boat, quite frankly, because Windows 10 isn't a horrendous disaster by all accounts. From my limited usage of it, I would say that it's not as good as 7, but, I could deal with it if I, was forced to. And so I just think that this Steam on Linux dream is over. If you look at the number of games available, I mean, yeah, it is growing and stuff, but all of the top ones that people actually want to play are just not available. And no serious gamer, I don't think, or very few serious gamers are going to move to Linux, at least for the foreseeable future. There are some gamers who also care about software freedom, even though Steam's proprietary and the games they're playing are proprietary, but whatever, they are going to want to play it on Linux. But the average person who cares about frame rates, DirectX 13, is it, the new one? They don't care about Linux. They care about having all the games available and playing as well as they possibly can. And they're just going to stick to Windows. That is the truth of the matter. And I think that Valve have taken far too long over this. They should have, fair enough, they must have had problems, but they should have just pressed ahead, got the boxes out there, possibly even subsidized those boxes, and possibly subsidized the controllers and got them in people's hands. And then we might have seen more development and more push towards games for Linux. But I think that this was a blip, and we're going to just go back to the old way where gamers just use Windows. In fact, I don't think there ever was a time when serious gamers were using Linux. I think that we in the Linux community were just deluding ourselves, quite frankly.
Well, I know you'll probably want to defend your prediction to Joe in a minute, Jesse. But before you do, I think it's worth throwing into the mix the Vulkan issue, because we've not really spoken about Vulkan on the show at all, as far as I can remember. And there are views within the industry that sort of an OpenGL replacement that is totally cross-platform could shake things up here, because it would mean that games running on Linux and on Android and such like very, very easy to move around between platforms, and could have a huge impact on how people actually approach their gaming. So maybe you want to think about that in your response as well?
No, I'll chalk that up as a positive in my court without having to add to it. And I would take Joe's point that, yes, it has taken a long time for Valve to come out with it. And yes, the opportunity of getting it into people's hands and getting it moving before Windows 10 came out is a good idea. But I think we're forgetting that Valve's reason for making Steam boxes and Valve's reason for moving on to Linux was because of their fear of Windows 10. Because all the things that are installed are now going through the Windows 10 App Store or the Windows Store, wherever it is. And so their worry was that if Windows and Microsoft didn't allow Steam onto that, obviously that'd be a bit of an idiot move, because no one would then buy PCs to play games that all stick with Windows 8 or what have you. They didn't have control over their own ecosystem, and the whole point of Steam is that you install it and you play games on it. And if you're not able to install it on the PC, then they don't have a money-making machine. So they wanted to move away from being dependent on Windows to having their own way of doing it. And if the Windows thing falls away, or if Steam boxes become a massive thing and compete one-to-one with the PlayStations and the Xboxes, long way down the line, let's say, they at least have their own sort of backup. They are independent of the reliance on Microsoft. So it's not so much that they're trying to do it in order to shake everything up. They're trying to do it to make sure that they have a viable future without relying on other people. Now, whether or not that means that my prediction comes true is looking incredibly unlikely. But when the Steam controllers come out, which I think is towards the end of this year, then we'll, see if that makes any kind of difference.
Well, we'll see, but as usual, I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
So let's move on and talk about Google and their antitrust issues. First of all, in the EU. And so they're facing the Google Redress and Integrity Platform. And so this is a website that is effectively like an ambulance chaser, no win, no fee type legal company, who are trying to get people to pay them to sue Google for not having their product in Google searches and having Google prioritize their own stuff over these third-party websites. And it's not only in Europe, it's also in India. Google are being threatened with a $1 billion fine, $1 billion over their biased search. Now, I've spoken about this before, and I just don't understand what this is about. I just don't understand. Google is a website that you go to, or, Android is an operating system on a phone that you buy. And obviously, they're going to prioritize their own services over third parties. But I don't understand the problem with that. It's like if someone asks me, what's the difference between Ubuntu Mate and Linux Mint Mate? I'm not going to say, go and listen to this random podcast about it that's got a great interview, when I can point them to an interview that I did, because I want them to listen to stuff that I've done.
So was the Microsoft antitrust also shouldn't have happened when they included IE with everything?
Yeah, that's fair enough. They made an operating system and put it on pretty much every machine you could buy that wasn't a Mac, and people bought it, and I just don't understand. Obviously, they're going to put their own browser on there. And, it's not like you can't install another browser. It's not like you can't install Linux on most machines that come with Windows, or at least back then. And it's not like you can't buy a Mac or not have a computer. I don't understand. I don't know. Is this me being like a real, like, big business person against what I'm normally into? But I don't understand how there can possibly be a case here.
Well, I'm not sure how popular a view with the listeners that will be, Joe, but I must admit I've got some sympathy for it. But should we move on and talk about Google and how they're bending over for governments in another situation? And that's in China. And Chinese devices often run a non-standard version of Android that's built from the open source project, but without any of the Google apps and services. And that's because the Play Store and related services aren't officially available there. I mean, they actually pulled out of China back in 2010 following some cyber attacks that were attributed to the Chinese government at the time. And they said they wouldn't come back and they wouldn't censor Chinese search results. They'd actually push all the Chinese traffic through Hong Kong to serve up uncensored search results. But, well, now they're going back into China.
Well, fair play to them. You know, they're not making any bones about it. The Play Store is going to be filtered. It's going to be, you know, at the behest of the Chinese government, what's actually in there and what people can install. And they're losing a load of money by not being there. And, you know, if they want to be evil, even though their slogan is don't be evil, then, you know, I don't really have a problem with it. As long as people know about it and that informs their choice as to whether to use Google services and products, then, yeah, no, don't have a problem with it. I mean, it's not what I would do if I had a company, but, you know, they're all about the bottom line, like most companies.
Yeah, it's an entirely hypocritical, money-rooted maneuver going against exactly the one thing you said you wouldn't do. But that is where the huge boon in profit is. And while everyone's using Android, they're getting no money from it. And all those people that have Android phones aren't using the services they want in order to better track them and all those sorts of things. So it's annoying that you can see where they're coming from, but at the same time, it does leave a bad taste in the mouth, given that they exited for fairly good reasons on censorship and these sorts of things that the Chinese government do. But going back in just to get a quick buck.
Quick yen, I think you'll find.
Indeed, yeah.
Is it yuan or something? Or is it?
Oh, it is, yeah. It's Japan that's the yen, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, though, how the relationships between these companies, they are multinational with huge amount of reach and power, and how that's shaking out the relationship between them and governments, and where the lines of responsibility lie and who has power over who in various jurisdictions. It's going to be an ongoing tug-of-war we see continuing for the next few years, I suspect. And the next story actually relates to this as well, and that's that Facebook's been told to obey German law on free speech. And in Germany, free speech means that you can't say anything about Nazis. Now, in the US, you can espouse Nazi ideals or talk about Nazis quite happily, and Facebook's based in the US. But if Facebook wants to do business in Germany, they've been told they can't. And a guy called Heiko Maas, I believe it is, said in an interview with Reuters, quote, "Holocaust denial and inciting racial hatred are crimes in Germany, and it doesn't matter if they're posted on Facebook or uttered out in the public on the market square." And really, the only comment I want to make on this is that if you think back to January this year, there was a lady by the name of Angela Merkel who was leading the line of a Solidarity March in Paris for the Je suis Charlie.
And I said it at the time that it was totally hypocritical. I don't know. Have you just put these stories in to try and wind me up today, Paddy? I swear you have.
It's looking that way, isn't it?
I mean, it's a bit of a dangerous subject to talk about this, especially with the Holocaust denial, because if you start saying that you should have the right to deny the Holocaust, people think that you are doing that. Now, I don't know. I've never looked into it. I don't suppose there's any decent grounding to deny the Holocaust. But the fact that you can't even question it, you can't question the numbers, you can't even talk about it without it being illegal, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I know that it was obviously this terrible thing that Germany's terribly ashamed of. And it's not just Germany, it's quite a few countries in Europe, actually, where you can go to prison in theory for questioning the Holocaust and denying it. And Americans must surely just be, you know, outraged at that because free speech is so dear to them. And we don't have free speech in this country either. There's certain things that you can't say. And it just really annoys me. I mean, at the same time, though, if that's their law, that's their law. And, you know, that's why I don't live in that country, or one of the reasons I don't live in that country, because I want to have free speech. And, you know, people should have the right to make an idiot of themselves, even if they're saying something, you know, that's just outrageously wrong. They should have the right to say that, you know, and even if it is something as outrageous as the Holocaust never happened. I mean, the majority of us are going to look at them and just say, you're, you know, crazy. What's wrong with you? But they shouldn't be imprisoned for that. They should just be ridiculed. But at the same time, if Facebook does want to do business there, then they have to obey their laws. So I don't know. Although it's an American company, I don't know, if their servers are in America and they say you can't sign up if you're German, wink, wink, then surely they could just get away with it. And, if people are violating their terms of service by signing up from within Germany, then that would be a quite simple way to get over it.
It's a huge quagmire, I think. I mean, a story I wasn't intending talking about today was the ongoing Microsoft DOJ dispute in the States, where they're claiming they can gain access to email held on a Microsoft server in Ireland. And Microsoft have turned around and said, no, you can't, because it's not in US jurisdiction. And that's going through the courts in the States at the moment. But I suspect very strongly that obviously the government will win and they'll be forced to turn over the emails from the server. So you've got states with overreach here. You've got companies with overreach. Obviously, all the data is accessible anywhere in the world unless it's being censored. I mean, another example is the right to be forgotten, which we've had within Europe, particularly within this country, where people are getting served different content or being forced to have different content served to them from the providers like Google. And it's just going to be a huge mess, isn't it?
Yeah, and censorship is the key word. We are talking about censorship here. And they like to dress it up as different things with different words, but we are talking about censorship. And I think that it's important to remember that.
We're talking about these massive corporations and the sort of influence they have. An open media group has been pulled together with companies as big as Microsoft, Google, Mozilla, Cisco, Intel, and Netflix and Amazon. And this consortium, the Alliance for Open Media, want to make open formats for video, audio, and images, but they're giving their initial priority solely to video. And the reason for this is that H.264 had a fairly cheap licensing format, so everyone could use it and Netflix weren't penalised too badly. But H.265 has a much more expensive licensing. And so companies like Netflix are going to have real problems using the codecs and affording to use it to stream all of their data. So they're trying to make this open source and free without any licenses, and therefore everyone can use it and no one gets penalized for it. And if it becomes a web standard, then it'll be used by all these companies and probably more.
And because of the people involved, you expect it to be adopted as a standard, don't you?
Yet another standard, just what we need. The problem's with patents, though, isn't it? And the fact that if you make a new codec, it doesn't matter that the technology is different from another one. It's the kind of ideas behind it are patent encumbered. So you'd have to make a completely new way of encoding video. So it seems like a bit of a tall order to me to make something that is totally free of patent problems.
Absolutely. You can reference two examples from both Microsoft and Google who have independently tried to make royalty-free codecs, and subsequently people have taken them to court because they have infringed patents. So if people of that size, companies that big can't do it without infringing multiple patents, then it's clearly more difficult than it would seem.
Well, it kind of escaped anyone's attention in the world about this terrible refugee crisis that's made all sorts of news headlines. And Google have decided to rummage around down the bottom of their sofa and have pulled out €1 million to help the refugees, which, I don't know, when these things happen, when huge companies like that give this kind of money, you feel a bit ambivalent about it. On the one hand, €1 million is an awful lot of money to basically almost anyone listening to this, I would imagine. But to a company like Google, they earn that sort of money every 8 minutes. So, you feel that they could have given more. But I suppose at the same time, they could have given nothing. So, you've got to be grateful, I suppose.
Yeah, there isn't an Apple headline saying how much they've given, because that would be a lot more. But they're also able to meet whatever it is that people donate if they go through a particular page. So we'll link it in the show notes, and if you look in there, you can donate through that Google page. Google will match your donation on top of the €1 million as well.
See, they still really are the good guys.
Yeah, they're not evil at all.
No, not at all. Well, we've not talked about crypto on the show for a while, so I thought we ought to. And we'll finish on a good news story, but let's start with one slightly less so, and that is that Phil Zimmermann, who wrote PGP, apparently doesn't use it. And in an email to security researcher Joseph Bunno, he said he couldn't decrypt a message because he didn't have, quote, a version of PGP that runs on my devices. Now, a staff writer at Motherboard, which is where I saw the story, got in touch with Zimmermann directly to clarify. and found out that he uses a MacBook and other Apple devices, and said that apparently no version of PGP has ever run on an iOS device. Apparently, Phil's considering firing up GNU PG at some stage or other, but he's not felt he's had the time to learn how to use it. And that's kind of why I wanted to bring the topic up, because we're forever told to use crypto. We're forever told how easy it is. And you've got the guy here who actually wrote PGP originally, confused and befuddled by how to use a bog standard crypto tool.
Yeah, I mean, it's not particularly hard to do it. It's just inconvenient. And if you've never done it before, it means you're going to have to read a little bit about how to do it. And I'm sure that he is more than capable of doing it, but he's just not going to, is he? Because he lives in a multiple device world by the sounds of things, with a laptop, a tablet, and a phone, albeit Apple ones. But I mean, it's the same story with Linux or Windows and whatever Android tablet or phone you've got. I went through a period where I was trying to use it as much as possible and trying to encrypt emails. And I would be out and about and I'd get one and it'd be like, okay, well, I can't read this until I get home and do it on my laptop. And yeah, I could have probably worked hard to get it working on my phone as well. But people are just not inclined to do that, are they?
They're not. And I think you're right. I think the article's actually sort of overselling it slightly, in that he could quite happily do it if he wanted to. But he just can't be bothered to actually invest the time to learn how to use a different tool. And I guess if I wash my mouth out afterwards, I can use a marketing term. It needs to be frictionless, doesn't it?
Yeah, or easy is
Okay, fair enough.
simpler term, yeah.
But even like big companies, I mean, this clearly is something that Google or other companies would want to include, and therefore have it as either a promotional gimmick so that other people think it's really good, or actually genuinely they care about people's privacy and making sure that things are cryptographically signed. But if they can't make it happen in an easy way, Google, air quotes, revolutionized the web mail because everyone now uses it and it's ubiquitous. But if they can't implement it as well, then it's clearly a significant barrier and isn't going to be implemented anytime soon in the current form.
Well, one of the things that makes it work is random numbers. And that's been a perennial problem, trying to generate a truly random number. And there are various solutions to do it. We're trying to introduce entropy. But now available direct from the FSF shop is the NUG or NOIG, which is a USB dongle, which is a true random number generator. And you can use that to, as the name suggests, generate true random numbers, which are essential in crypto.
Yeah, and it's $50. It's free as in freedom hardware design, and the schematics are available under Creative Commons license.
And gets its randomness from these 4 sensors. So it's not actually, using variables which are on the PC, which may not be random enough for it. It takes different sensor readings from sort of temperature and light and things, and then compares them and combines them and tries to produce this absolutely random number, which, as Joe pointed out, is essential for cryptography.
Yeah, and it's great that the schematics are out there, so it's not just this lockdown product. Anyone could make one in theory. So, a positive end to the news for a change. Now, we've been threatening to talk about this for an awfully long time, and so the time has finally come to have an overpint about funding online content. Now, do you do it through adverts? Do you do it through paywalls? Or is there some magical third way that no one's thought of just yet?
Yeah, we're very often discussing in the news ad blockers or things like Privacy Badger to stop people from forcing ads upon you, and they have to think up new ways of getting them in your face or making them pop up in front of the actual web page you want to go to, not only down the left-hand side and right-hand side. And there's this battle between the ad blocker and the ads trying to sort of either make it through, and there's the discussion about whether or not AdBlock Plus is doing the right thing by blocking everything and then allowing certain paid ads to come through, which in my mind seems entirely against what it's based for. It's supposed to be blocking ads, not making money out of whitelisting ads. And it's often the case that people want everything to be, blocked from view because that makes a nicer experience. But then the places which are making the money that they're going to aren't able to make the money without ads. So there's this classic catch-22, and neither side is going to agree, are they?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about with Adblock Plus in the real world would be called protection money.
Well, except that you're only talking about the defaults with Adblock Plus, aren't you? It might be that you can pay them to remove your adverts from the list, but the user can easily add your adverts back in. You know, take YouTube, for example. I found just a rule or whatever it is to add to Adblock Plus, and no more YouTube adverts, even though Google have paid them to exclude them by default. So I don't think it counts as a protection racket, to be honest. I think that it's kind of leaning towards that, but at the same time, because it is open to be added to that list, and it's up to the user, you know, and fair enough, you have to be savvy, but you have to be savvy enough to install it in the first place, and it's not that hard to add new stuff to it.
Yeah, I was just thinking this actually, that not only there's almost two levels of sort of technical aptitude, because you have to firstly know there's a way of blocking them and therefore install it. But dare I say it, I haven't made it to the second level because I ditched it and used Privacy Badger instead. And I didn't realize that you could add more to it in order to re-enable the blocking of Google ads. So there's this sort of two-tier hierarchy, those that don't install it at all, those that do, and then those that carry on and add to it.
Yeah, well, anytime I see an advert, I right-click on it and add to block list. And then it's really good. You can either block just the image that you're seeing or the subdomain from which it comes or the whole domain. So if it's like doubleclick.com or whatever. And so you can just blanket block stuff. And that does get a little bit dangerous because I did block, I think, something from Amazon Images, and that just broke the whole CSS for Amazon. So I had to whitelist it again. But it is really easy to do.
Yeah, I did exactly the same thing with Privacy Badger. I turned everything off, and then some of the key things that made the site actually useful were off. So I had to very carefully go back through and look. But so let's say you go to one of these sites that is presenting either Linux news or whatever it might be, the content that you want to go and see, and you block all their adverts, and next month they're not online because everyone's blocked all their adverts. Who's the loser then?
Well, just look at the H, which was h-online.com, I think, which was the English or the UK version of Heiser. And Fab from Linux Outlaws moved to London to work for them. And after about 18 months or something, they had to close it down because it wasn't making any money. And that's because the kind of people who are interested in the news coverage are the kind of people who are going to use AdBlock. And that is a prime example of how dangerous AdBlock can be. It can literally put people out of work. And from a purely selfish and pragmatic point of view, it took away a resource of detailed and interesting news. So, you know, that the users who were blocking the ads shot themselves in the foot there.
Yeah, so maybe they should have gone to a paywall. And then if the people genuinely were interested in that sort of area of topics and wanted the detail that the H used to provide, they would have had to pay for it. And they may have continued, or does paywalls actually put people off?
Well, yeah, I think paywalls definitely put people off. I am not going to pay for it. I don't know. I mean, maybe I would have paid a little bit because that coverage was really useful. But I think most people aren't. They expect it to be free. We've kind of grown up in this internet world where everything is free, and it's kind of too late to start charging for it. I mean, I know there are newspaper companies who have tried it and to some extent succeeded. Like the Times is still going, and that's been paywalled for quite some time now. But then you look at other websites of newspapers that implement the paywall, and then their readership drops off massively. But they're probably still making as much money. You know, there are far fewer people going and reading it, but as long as they're making the same amount of money as they did from adverts, it doesn't really matter to them, does it?
This is one of the key questions, isn't it? I mean, one of the links I put in for us to have a look at jointly before we talked about this was a claim that the advertising market amounted to 130 billion last year. 130 billion. And also that only 2% of users would be willing to actually cough up the equivalent in funding for individual sites. So there's a huge disconnect there.
Yeah, and I think it comes to the sort of dare I say, a generation gap. Like, if there was no internet and all the newspapers you had to go and buy physically, you would pick your favourite newspaper and you would pay money for their view or their reporting style. Whereas now I'm used to the idea that I can get BBC News for free and the Guardian News, and the fact that there is the Times, but it's behind a paywall, just means I won't look at it because I can get the information I'm looking for, the headlines and things, somewhere else. But if they were all paywalled and you couldn't go to anywhere for sort of up-to-date general politics and sort of current affairs and things, then you would have to pick the one that you wanted to go and see. And that's where I don't like it, because you have to have one view or one particular narrative, and it may well be, in our country, a Tory paper or a Lib Dem paper or a Labour sort of supporting paper. Then you get a bit brainwashed to that way of thinking, or you want to have that way of thinking thrown at you. Whereas the fact that I'm used to going, as I say, Google have various news resources like Reuters and things, and The Guardian is free and the BBC is free. You get literally free as in cost, so you don't want to pay for it. Whereas, as I say, back in the day, you had to pick one to pay for. And I think maybe the people who would go out and get the newspaper are now don't see it as an odd thing to pay for a paywall. They actually get the newspaper without having to go out in the cold and get it. Whereas, the younger generation, like you were saying, Joe, expect it all to be free and are surprised when they have to pay.
And they seem to be quite happy with the trade-offs as well, with their privacy and giving their data away. Just casting my mind back to the discussions you had with Kat Matfield at OpenTech.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where advertising and trackers make their money, by seeing where you're going and seeing what things it is you're buying and making sure the ads are sort of tailored towards you. And you're right, people are a lot less sort of worried about giving away the privacy and just get on with it, sort of thing.
So we've been rattling around the topic of ad blockers and advertising online, as we do on a regular basis. You suggested, Joe, paywalls, fine, we're all aware of those. I haven't really seen any attempts to do anything else other than straight advertising or paywalls, apart from in very niche markets.
Yeah, so there's a link that you're referring to in Germany, and this startup has only been going for a couple of years, from what I remember. They have actually managed to get every single news-producing website and newspaper all to sign up to this micro-payment system. So it obviously wouldn't work if half of them were free and half of them were behind a paywall, but they've got every single national, weekly or daily newspaper, and they've all signed up. And so you can see, I think it works where you see the headlines and you can pick on the headlines, and you pay a very small amount per article that you read, but it goes to all of the different newspapers depending on which headline it is you've selected to read. So you'd almost have like a prepaid account, Google Wallet, whatever it may be, match it up to this paywall system, and rather than having to do a £15 a month to just read one newspaper, you'd pay £15 a month, but that £15 would be spread across all the different papers, which to me seems like the most sensible way of doing it, because you still get to get the full range, everyone still gets paid, you also, I assume, avoid a lot of adverts, but you don't actually get pinned into just one newspaper. I worry that it wouldn't work in this country because of the BBC.
Yeah, I think you're right there. The BBC has to be free because we've already paid for it, haven't we, with our license fee, or certainly those of us who own a television. But yeah, if everything else was part of that and the BBC wasn't, then you'd have this uncomfortable situation where they kind of had the monopoly of freedom or freeness. So yeah, I can't see that working. And a problem I would have with it is that it seems too expensive per article. I mean, they were talking sort of 20, 30 pence per article, which seems a lot to me if you're reading a lot of articles from one particular paper or website. I think more of a kind of flatter model where it is going to be £15 a month or whatever, spread between everything that you look at. So if you look at 100 articles, then it's 15p each, whereas if you look at 1,000, it's 1.5. That would be a better way to handle it, I think, rather than just a flat fee, because if you read loads, then it's just not going to work out kind of economically viable, I don't think.
I can see the attraction with that, but is there not a big privacy issue there in the fact they would have to track everything you did in order to apportion the money?
What, like they're not doing that anyway?
Does that make it right?
Well, I mean, surely they have to apportion the money as it is anyway, because it's costing you, 15p or 20p per article. And surely they know which articles you're looking at. So I don't think that to do it more of a flatter way would be any less invasive to privacy.
Yeah, as long as you didn't sign up to this with your Google or Facebook account, which would then know all the articles you like to read. And when you aren't looking at these websites, you're looking at some completely non-news related website, they then start giving you loads of maybe car adverts or something if you've been particularly interested in the car topics. But if you had a separate logon, which then absolutely rightly checked which articles you clicked on and divided the cost by all those articles, then you do have to track it, but as long as you're only tracking the things you're reading in order to divide the money, and I know it's going to be a big if that information stays within that one little community, let's call it, it wouldn't be such a problem. Also, Joe's idea of dividing the money does actually mean that if you spent £15 a month, it would encourage people to read lots of news articles because then you get your money's worth.
Yeah, exactly. It's like having Netflix and you feel like you've got to use it all the time to get your money's worth.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, whilst this system for the newspapers is interesting, it's very similar to something we've talked about in the news on the show previously, and that's a service called Google Contributor. And the idea there is that Google will take a certain amount of money from you every month and then apportion it out to the websites that you visit. I'm just curious as to whether, if we think this is a good idea in principle, we're better off having a lot of small niche systems like these newspaper guys on their own, or allowing things to go through a big centralized service, a Google of this world, if you like, who will obviously be taking their own cut and also keeping a very close eye on everything you do.
Yeah, this actually goes to something I've been pondering in my head whilst we've been discussing it. This is fine for, like you say, a niche group which has got a monopoly over all of the newspapers. They're all the print newspapers, and that's just for current ongoing news in Germany. But let's say you wanted to look at all of the tech websites and you're annoyed by their adverts. Would you have to have a separate group just for all technology websites and a separate group for all cookery websites and a separate group for all home furnishings? And do you then sign up to them individually? You wouldn't want to do that. So you would want one big group to have everything under the umbrella for a sheer ease of use. And you go blindly walking into exactly what you're pointing out. A big company like Google, or even if it was a brand new company made for this, would then know everything you looked at.
Well, as usual, we think we've got a solution, but then it seems that we haven't. But maybe some of you out there have got some suggestions and potential solutions to this. If you have, we'd love to hear from you. But with that, then, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com or find us on Twitter, Google+, or Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye all.
See you later.